It's time for a JavaScript aside, and this aside will help us understand how the event emitter is a fundamental building block of many parts of the Node.js JavaScript side of the core. This is object.create and prototypes. You'll remember that when we talked about prototypal inheritance in JavaScript, that meant that we can have an object that might have a property that we can call, but every object also has a prototype, which is another object that it points to as its prototype, which may have different properties, and then we can still access those properties on that prototype directly. And the prototype has its own prototype. And anywhere down that chain, the prototype chain, we can access those properties and methods of any of the objects along the prototype chain. And that's how JavaScript accomplishes the idea of inheritance, and that many different objects can actually point to the same object as its prototype, allowing it to also have access to the same properties and methods. We've seen that. Now, there are a number of ways to set up the prototype chain, to set up objects and say what they inherit from. We've already seen function constructors. There's classes in the new version of JavaScript, ES6. The class idea has a keyword called extends that sets up the prototype chain. And there's one more very simple approach that JavaScript has, which I really like. Let's say I have a simple person object and a greet function. And I'll just make this very simple. So I have my object. Now, let's say I want to use this as the base. I want this to be the prototype of some other objects that I create. So instead of using a function constructor to construct the object, I'm just using an object literal. I'm just building the object itself that will be my prototype. The objects that are created ultimately are the same, but it's just a different way of creating them. So I can say I'll have an object, let's say, called John, and I can use object, the capital O, dot create, and then tell it what to create that object from. When I'm done, I'll have an empty object, John, whose prototype is this person object, meaning the John object will have access to first name, last name, greet, all the methods and properties. And I can overwrite them or block the ones on the prototype by simply adding properties and methods of the same name directly to the object. So when the JavaScript engine looks for first name, it will find it on the John object and not bother going down the chain to find it on person. But if I say greet, it won't find it on John, and it'll go down to the person object and find it there. I could do the same thing. Let's say I'll just copy paste this and create a second object, Jane, different first name, but created from the same object, person. So both of these objects will point to person as their prototype. And so they'll both share this greet function. So I can then use it. So let's console.log john.greet and console.log jane.greet. So both of these objects have access down the prototype chain to that method. Again, object.create is a very simple, fast, and clean way to set up inheritance, that is, the prototype chain, that is, objects being able to use properties and methods of other objects. Let's look at this visually. So we had a person object, which had some properties on it, first name, last name, a greet method. And then when we used object.create, we said object.create and passed to it person, and that set up a new object, an empty one. We called it John, and it set up the prototype chain. So John's prototype was person. It was pointing at person as its prototype, which means we could access first name, last name, greet. And then we added some of our own properties, first name and last name, which essentially hid the first name property on the person object, and instead we'd see the one directly on John. Then we used object.create again to create Jane, and so Jane was also pointing at person as its prototype. We also hid the first name and last name by adding our own properties directly on the Jane object. And then we could call John and Jane.greet because the greet method was available down the prototype chain. So again, object.create is a very simple, clean, and clear way to set up a sequence of objects that inherit from one another, a prototype chain. And so this idea of setting this up is key to understanding how the event emitter becomes a fundamental core piece upon which many other elements inside Node.js's core are constructed. All right, let's move on and see.